Hello, welcome to another installment of Professor Zaldivar's brief lectures for Intro to Philosophy. Today we're talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and his proofs of God's existence. But before we get to the actual arguments, I want to say a little bit about St. Aquinas himself. He was inarguably the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages and one of the greatest philosophers of all time. He is most renowned for his integration of Aristotle and Christian doctrine. It is safe to say that Aquinas' legitimization of Aristotle and reconciliation of Aristotelian thinking with Christian doctrine advanced Western culture immeasurably. Without him, we really would not be our culture would be radically different. But before we get to the arguments, I want to point out a couple of different things. First of all, he had a kind of interesting line that I always like to show my students. At one point, he is reputed to have been given a vision of Christ, and afterwards he had stopped working for a while and was this kind of malaise, and one of his friends asks him, "Why aren't you working? What is wrong?" And he replies, "I cannot go on. All that I have written seems to me to be like so much straw compared to what I have seen and what has been revealed to me." I think that's a really great line, and I think it shows a lot of his devotion. I also want to point out that I think St. Aquinas looks an awful lot like Sean Connery, which I think is just kind of awesome. In his essay, you might notice that it's really written in a weird style. It's interesting, in the Middle Ages when he was writing, this was not a weird style at all. This was actually the perfectly normal way for philosophers to do their work. But in contemporary eyes, it looks a little weird, and the style needs to be explained. And on the screen I've put these explanations. The things I want to point out to you is that his positions, the things that Aquinas was actually saying to be true, is located in the I answer portion. The objections are common arguments that were considered plausible at his time. On the contrary, list common rebuttals to those initial arguments, and the replies list Aquinas' specific objections or specific replies to the objections portion. But again, the main idea is that the actual Thomistic thoughts, the thoughts of St. Aquinas, are found in the sections that say are listed under the I answer position. So, I want to point out that there are 5 arguments that we'll be considering shortly. They all seem to have a very common structure. First, Aquinas notices that there's something that is unexplainable in the world. There's some feature of the world that we can't explain very simply or at all. And so he posits the existence of God as an explanation for that missing feature or for that problem. Let's take a look at an application of that general structure. His first argument is called the first mover or the prime mover argument. And it's a pretty straightforward argument. He says movement comes about by a change from potential to actual. So a thing cannot be potentially X and actually X at the same time. A thing cannot be both actually moving and potentially moving at the same time, which means that a thing cannot be both a mover and moved. A thing cannot be both its moving and its own source of movement. Notice, furthermore, that you can't simply say, well, everything has a mover. So one way to get around the objection is to say, okay, if a thing cannot be its own mover, its own reason for moving, then everything just has a mover. The problem is that this would mean everything has a mover backwards into infinity. And this means that nothing ever starts moving, right? Because everything always has movement as in something before it. This means motion is impossible, and we cannot ever have a first mover. So there must be a first mover. In order to make motion possible, there must be a first mover. And of course, Aquinas would say, well, the first mover must be God. We see a very similar argument. And again, we notice that that's the general structure, right? What's missing? Well, a source of movement. And God is posited as the explanation for the missing source of movement. We see a very similar argument here in the efficient cause argument. This is often called the cosmological argument by philosophers. St. Aquinas notices that things cannot be their own efficient cause. You cannot be the reason that you are here, right? Nothing can be the reason for itself. Nothing can bring about itself. At least nothing in the physical world can. So there must be a first efficient cause, a thing which brings about itself. And of course, that first efficient cause is God. The third argument is an argument from the possibility of existence. I actually think this is a really interesting argument, and it's a little bit better than the prime mover or the cosmological argument, or at least I think it's more interesting. He starts off by noticing that everything could at some point in time not be around, right? So for all things that exist now, there was some point in time where they didn't exist in the past, or maybe some point in time that they won't exist in the future. But Aquinas is actually looking more at the past. So he says, look, for everything that exists now, there may have been some point in time in the past where it didn't exist, right? So at some point in the past, it's inevitable that at some point in the past, there was nothing. Of all the things that do exist, if you think of things as coming in and out of existence, then at some point in the past, it must have been the case, by sheer chance, if nothing else, that nothing existed. But if there was a chance, if there was a time when nothing existed, then there would be no reason for anything to exist now, because nothing can come from nothing. So if we have a universe with nothing in it, an empty universe, then there would be nothing in the universe to create the next thing, right? So you can see how that goes, right? If you have an empty universe, then there is nothing in the universe to create anything else. So there must be a necessary thing, and not just any necessary thing, a self-necessary thing, a thing which exists all and entirely on its own. Of course, if there's a thing which exists all and entirely on its own, it can be the cause of existence of other things. And of course, this thing which exists all and entirely of its own is God. I think this is kind of a neat argument, and I've given you a very simple version of it. The version in the book is a little bit more interesting, so I encourage you, of course, to go read through that. The fourth argument is kind of an odd one, and it's grounded in the idea that all properties reflect their ultimate cause. So fire is hot because it reflects some sort of ultimate fire, right, which is the ideal form of heat. And something is cold because it reflects the ideal form of this ultimate, most coldest thing possible. Back in the Middle Ages, they thought cold was a separate property from heat, so that's how you would have explained being cold. So all properties reflect their ultimate cause. Existence is a property which must reflect some sort of ultimate existence, right? And what would be the thing that would have ultimate existence? Of course, God. So because we exist, our existence must reflect some greatest possible existence or some ultimate existence, and of course it would be God who has that. A more natural way, or maybe a more intuitive way of expressing the same sort of causal mechanism is to say our goodness must reflect some ultimate goodness, right? So our goodness is obviously not perfect, but goodness is a property which reflects a kind of perfect ideal of goodness somewhere, and of course the thing that is perfectly good would be God. So in other words, we need God to explain things like our own existence and our own goodness. Like I said, it's a weird argument. I do want to point out also that this is not the ontological argument. This is actually different from St. Anselm's ontological argument. And it would be a good idea for you to spend some time thinking about what exactly the differences are between Aquinas' argument about the cause of being versus the ontological argument that we saw in St. Anselm. Okay, the final argument is another famous one. It's the teleological argument. Here he says, mindless things act in a way that achieves the best result. So, water falls on crops in order to hydrate them and help them grow. Bees pollinate flowers. worms and beetles turn biomatter into fertilizer, which helps plants grow. Plants feed animals. Animals feed each other. Predators die and feed the rest of the ecosystem. There's all sorts of non-intelligent things in the universe that seem to work in a particularly really effective and efficient way. But this sort of interaction is only possible by design, right? It's really not possible by pure luck. But of course, mindless things can't direct themselves. So rain doesn't decide where to fall. Flowers don't decide to be nourished by sunlight, etc. And so this is evidence for a designer, right? A God which is responsible for making sure that the world and the universe works like clockwork. If this argument sounds familiar to you, it's probably because it's the exact same argument as the intelligent design argument, which you may have been hearing about in recent news or online. The intelligent design argument is basically a modern version of the teleological argument, and they're pretty much exactly the same argument. Those are the 5 arguments for the existence of God that St. Aquinas gives. The cosmological and the teleological are absolutely the most famous arguments that he gives, and along with the ontological argument are the 3 most well-known arguments for the existence of God. Whether they are fully successful arguments or not, I will leave as an exercise to the student. This concludes the lecture on St. Thomas Aquinas and the proofs of God's existence, and this has been another brief introduction to philosophy by Professor Zaldivar. Thank you for listening.